This is BBC News, the headlines. The White House says President Biden will decide in the next 24 hours if the US will keep its forces in Kabul past the current deadline of the 31st of August. The Taliban are hostile to an extension. Pfizer's two-dose COVID-19 vaccine has received full approval from the US Food and Drug Administration, the first jab to be licensed in the country. The vaccine had up until now only been given emergency use authorization. In Germany, tighter restrictions have come into force to access a wide range of services. They'll largely be restricted to those who've been vaccinated, tested negative or have recovered from the virus recently. Poland says it'll begin erecting a fence along its border with Belarus in response to a surge in migration that it says is organised by Minsk. Belarus denies allegations it's orchestrating the crisis in response to sanctions. This is BBC News. Who am I talking to? There you are. Hello and welcome to our look ahead to what the papers will be bringing us tomorrow. With us, Jason Beattie, Assistant Editor of the Daily Mirror, and Sian Griffiths, Education Editor at the Sunday Times. Welcome both. Let's start with the front pages then. According to the Times, Britain is increasingly resigned to having to conclude its evacuation from Kabul by the end of the week, after the Taliban warned that any delay in the withdrawal process would cross a red line. While the Metro highlights the Taliban spokesman warning that Western forces would provoke a reaction if they were not gone by the end of this month. The Guardian says Britain has begun a last-ditch scramble to get people out of Kabul amid warnings from the senior diplomat on the ground that staying past the 31st of August deadline may not be realistic and risks provoking the Taliban. The Eye says the UK doesn't want to set a date for the last RAF flight out of Kabul for fear of worsening the situation there. Meanwhile, the Daily Telegraph reports that a suspect on the UK's no-fly watch list made it to Britain from Afghanistan after being allowed to board an evacuation flight at Kabul airport. However, a Home Office spokesperson has said that an individual was flagged in a rigorous checks process, but upon further investigation, they are now not a person of interest to the security agencies or law enforcement. Let's start with the Guardian, Jason, and the headline, Race to Complete Kabul Airlift Amid Taliban Threat. We'll talk about the Taliban in a minute, but this picture is what it's all about, isn't it? That these are the conditions that people are clamouring towards, a huge military plane to get them to safety.
Yeah, and the tragedy is that some of the people won't be able to get out, but we will have to leave people behind. And we know it's chaotic in Kabul airport. We know that people are queuing to try and get on a flight to safety. We know that some of the paperwork is difficult to access, that people are being turned away, and it must be, you know, extremely anxious moment for those people trying to get out of a country.
And we've seen some of the scenes at Kabul airport, but peculiarly, Taliban and allied forces, Sian, working alongside each other for the moment at least.
Yes, for the moment at least. And it looks as though until August the 31st, hopefully that will continue. But the Taliban are being very uncompromising about extending the evacuation beyond that date. And the Metro has a headline, 7 days to go, Joe, the Taliban's red line. And the Taliban are making it clear that beyond August the 31st, they don't want the evacuations to continue. And they have said there will be consequences if there is an attempt to extend it beyond that date.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting, the Taliban's position, Jason, isn't it? Because they want to be seen as a legitimate government rather than just a de facto authority. And you wonder how much play that gives the international community to get them to negotiate over extending this August the 31st deadline. What have they got to gain by it?
I mean, it is quite extraordinary that within days, the Taliban have regained control of the country and are now effectively dictating the terms of withdrawal to America and her allies. And this was kind of unforeseen. It was a terrible intelligence failure. And we're living with the consequences. And those consequences will be people's lives put at risk once the final withdrawal has taken place, if they don't get on the planes out of it. Now, do we have any leverage? Possibly, but it's quite narrow and it's quite limited. The Americans set this deadline without a great deal of thought about the consequences. The Taliban are now using it to say, look, this is what happens if you don't abide by this agreement. Then there could be violent consequences, which will make an already desperate situation a lot worse. So possibly we have some financial leverage. The Americans who have held about $420 billion or $20 million in the latest round of financial support. The Taliban will need that because they've got to pay civil servants. They've got to try and keep the Afghan economy working. But we know from experience, we know from what happened before, they're also quite happy to shut themselves off away from the world and just go, look, this is how we run our country. So it's not a great deal of leverage, and it will rise on an awful lot of trust, which I'm quite sceptical about.
Yes, I mean, they've been waiting 20 years for this moment. They're not going to let go. The Taliban are not going to let go lightly, are they? And nobody's suggesting that anybody's going to hang around to tackle them. I mean, there's the troops are going, and that's it. I mean, we are getting a report through, Sian, that Joe Biden is expected to decide in the next 24 hours whether he's going to extend that withdrawal deadline in order to give the Pentagon time to prepare. I mean, they've had time to prepare. This was the deadline, and yet we've seen this chaos. I mean, and he is going to face quite a lot of pressure from a rather splintered G7 in the summit tomorrow.
Yes, so G7 hosted by Boris Johnson is likely to be asking Joe Biden to put pressure on the Taliban to extend the deadline. But all the noises coming out of America at the moment don't seem to suggest that Joe Biden's minded to do that. The interesting story in the Times is a front page story, which is really very negative about the idea that the deadline will be extended. It's quoting Laurie Bristow, Britain's ambassador to Afghanistan, saying that he told MPs that trying to stay beyond the 31st would definitely provoke a reaction from the Taliban. And then we've got the Armed Forces Minister, James Heappey, saying that what could happen if they did try to stay beyond the 31st is that British soldiers would, on the one hand, be trying to shepherd Afghans onto planes, while at the same time trying to fend off, firefighting from the Taliban, which doesn't seem like a scenario that one wants to go to. So the Times is interesting because it has some numbers as well. It's saying that 7,000 people have been moved out of Afghanistan on RAF planes, and there are 4,000 British passport holders and Afghan support staff that they think they will get out by the deadline. But that leaves another 2,000 people that they would like to get out but may not be able to. And then there's a huge question about what will happen to them.
Yes, and the Taliban has given some assurances about girls' education, Jason, about women's rights, about freedom of the media. But there are groups of people, notably the LGBTQ+ community in Afghanistan, who are not part of those considerations at all, and they are terrified of what's going to happen to them.
Well, yes, they are the most immediate threat. But Martine, I'm worried about this. We saw what the Taliban did before. We saw the horrific abuse of human rights. We saw the repression, the suppression of girls' education. We saw the kind of the destruction of historic artifacts. And have they changed? I mean, that's the big question. And I'm not entirely sure they have. I'm very, very, very cynical about this, maybe, but I don't see any evidence that they've changed dramatically.
Let's move on to another story, also on the Times, though, Jason. Chemists to offer free blood pressure checks in Heart Health Drive. Another reason to visit your local pharmacy.
Yeah, on the face of this is very good news. I mean, they estimate that it could save up to 2,000 lives a year, prevent thousands of strokes and other kind of cardiac conditions. It's a great reminder of how important chemists are as well. A lot of the local pharmacies have been struggling, and here's, they do take a lot of pressure off the front line of the NHS. They take a lot of pressure off GPs, and giving them this greater responsibility, I think is a great idea.
Yeah, and it's might safeguard some of the pharmacies that have been under more pressure to close in recent times, Sian, if they are able to offer services like this, and we're going to turn up and use them. They can demonstrate how valuable they are.
Yes, so as James says, it's a really good idea. It would lead to people being able to have free blood pressure checks at pharmacies right across the UK, and that could save, as James says, 2,000 lives, because high blood pressure is an indicator for conditions that are killers like heart attacks or strokes, and very sadly, quite often. When somebody has a heart attack, their first heart attack is sometimes fatal. So it would be fantastic to see this service up and operating in 11,300 NHS pharmacies, which is what it's being projected to go into. I guess it's worth saying that high blood pressure is not. You could have, blood pressure that was okay, and that wouldn't necessarily mean that you didn't have a heart condition. So there are other checks that I think would need to be done before you could be absolutely sure that your heart was in good condition. So it seems to me, although a good thing in many ways, it is not the same as going to a GP and having the full range of tests that one should have, I think, if you wanted to be really, really sure that your heart was in good condition. There are other tests, blood tests and so on, that one ought to have. So I feel a bit worried that it's a bit of a piecemeal service, but obviously with all the pressure on the NHS at the moment, it's good that at least this is being thought about.
Yeah, and it might flag up a few problems for people who wouldn't have otherwise known. That may be the thinking. The Daily Telegraph is where we'll go next for a couple of stories. First, majority of care homes expect to sack staff if current rate of vaccine refusal persists. Sian, 6 in 10 care homes say that they'll be forced to sack members of staff if they won't get vaccinated in time to meet the government's deadline.
Yeah, so the government's deadline for having your first vaccination, if you're care home staff, is September the 16th. And then the rules come into force on November the 11th, by which time you're supposed to have had 2 vaccinations. And this is a survey of care home staff. And it is pretty worrying because it is suggesting that a high percentage of care home managers think that a lot of their staff are not going to get vaccinated in time. And that could lead to 40,000 staff, which is about 7% of the care home workforce, actually either quitting or being sacked. And given that the sector's under huge pressure already with not enough care home workers to look after our elderly population, this is only going to make things worse. But kind of against that, you can see the logic of it, given that elderly residents in care homes are at such risk of COVID. If they contract it, they're very, very likely to be hospitalised or die. And we've seen the virus sweep through care homes. I can understand why this rule's been brought in, and that people are being asked, if they're working with elderly people in care homes, to have the vaccination. It makes sense.
It's a collision of rights, I suppose, in some ways, Jason, isn't it? I mean, it's been described as tantamount to moral blackmail, which infringes on the human rights of these care workers, if they're forced to have the vaccine. But then that's set against the rights of the care home residents, who need to feel that they're safe and not at risk, an unnecessary risk of COVID.
Yeah, I think Sian made quite a good point when we discussed this earlier. Which is, if you work in a care home, wouldn't you want to be vaccinated if you knew it was going to, protect the people you're meant to be caring for? It's a really difficult one, this. I can see both sides of the argument. I mean, I understand that, one of the reasons we have actually quite a successful uptake of a vaccine, quite high levels compared with some other kind of comparable European countries. It's because we do it by consent and it's not forced upon you. And that kind of voluntary take-up has been proved very successful. But I also kind of entirely understand that, if you have an elderly relative or a loved one in a care home, you would want them to be safe. You would want them to be safe from COVID, especially when you know that at least 25,000 people have died in care homes from COVID. So it is a difficult one. But ultimately, I think, the protection of the vulnerable probably kind of outweighs the imposition of human rights on the staff in the care homes. Let's
stay with the Daily Telegraph and look at one of the two Paralympians who are going to be carrying the flag when the Paralympics in Tokyo open tomorrow night. And this particular article, we'll come on to the other one in a moment, but this particular article, Sian, is the oldest member of Great Britain's Paralympics team. Tell us who he is.
He's John Stubbs. He's the archer. He's 56, and he's going to be carrying the flag at the opening ceremony, along with the swimmer Ellie Simmonds. And his story is absolutely extraordinary. As James said earlier, he required a 68-pint blood transfusion after being run over twice in a road traffic incident, and very sadly had his right leg amputated. It's his fourth Paralympics. He is a gold medalist, extraordinary resilience and bravery and athleticism, really. And he's with the swimmer Ellie Simmonds, who actually was the youngest swimmer in 2008. She was only 13 when she won a gold medal at that Paralympics. So the two of them, this will be the fourth Olympics for both of them, and they are carrying the flag tomorrow at the opening ceremony.
Indeed, and a particularly poignant year for John Stubbs, because his father died, so his family really looking forward to this uplifting occasion, I'm sure, Jason.
Yeah, and this is kind of partly what makes the Olympics and the Paralympics so special. It's the human stories behind the competitors. You admire the athleticism, you admire the kind of dedication, the training, but it's when you hear and read more about the personal kind of battles they've done to get there. That's kind of what really impresses you in the end, isn't it?
You mentioned Ellie Simmonds, Sian, and Jason, here she is, ready to go in Tokyo. A picture of her in action in the pool. I mean, it's hard to imagine a Paralympic Games without Ellie Simmonds in it, Jason.
And she's only 26, and just for 5 golds so far, I think. Is that right? Maybe.
I think so, yeah. I mean, talk about overachieving.
Yeah.
What surprised me, though, Sian, is to read that Ellie Simmonds will be the first woman to carry the flag for Great Britain at Summer Games since a fellow swimmer, Maggie McElhenney, 21 years ago. I mean, I think that's shameful.
But it's surprising, isn't it? But one of the good things about this Games starting tomorrow is that there's roughly equal, I think, numbers of female and male competitors in Team GB, which I think is a really, really good thing. And Ellie is interesting as well, because obviously as a swimmer, she hasn't been able to train so much during the pandemic because a lot of the pools have been closed. So I think in some sports, athletes have had a particular difficulty getting up to speed for these games. And I think also, as swimmers, both in the Olympics and the Paralympics, are making the point that we must keep our pools open when we come out of this crisis, so that the next generation of young people can come through and learn to swim, because there's a real risk that a lot of the pools won't open again because it's just too expensive to open some of our very old Victorian swimming baths. So that would be a real shame if we lost some of those.
Yes, that was discussed a lot after the London Olympics, wasn't it? And legacy and trying to get us all back into the pool and back out exercising. 147 medals we've got to beat from Rio, and apparently we might well be able to do it. We will see when the action starts. Sian and Jason, very, very lovely to see you, and thank you so much for talking through the papers for us tonight. That's it for the papers tonight. Do buy one or subscribe to one tomorrow, won't you? That's it from me. Night-night.